She inquired, "You're wealthy. Why did you rescue me?" He never anticipated the response would alter their lives indefinitely. The day started as usual in Henry Lawson's realm, tranquil, deliberate, and meticulously predictable. From the expansive windows of his Manhattan apartment, the cityscape sprawled boundlessly, a testament to all he had achieved. He was the head of a worldwide tech conglomerate, the visionary behind some of the most groundbreaking software advancements of the era. People respected him, dreaded him, coveted him, but none truly understood him. Not anymore. He sat at the end of his sleek glass dining table, swirling a mug of cold black coffee. He wasn't scanning the morning headlines. He wasn't even glancing at his inbox. He was simply gazing, through the coffee's vapor, through the glass, through the walls of protection he had painstakingly constructed over years of grief and restraint. The intercom hummed. It was his aide, Jordan, notifying him that some physical mail had arrived. Strange, given how digital his existence had become. "There's a letter for you." No sender noted. "It's handwritten," Jordan stated, her voice curious. That piqued Henry's interest enough to step away from the table. Moments later, he stood before his oak desk, eyeing a cream-colored envelope with slightly worn edges. The script was refined but shaky. His name was penned in cursive, as if someone had meticulously crafted it. He opened it cautiously, more from intrigue than worry. But by the time he finished reading, his knees nearly buckled beneath him. The letter came from Sarah Monroe. Her name hadn't surfaced in his thoughts for years, not because she was insignificant, but because recalling her was too painful. They had met 8 years prior. She was unlike the women in his circle, kind, confident, empathetic in a way that unsettled him. For a short time, he had allowed himself to be open with her, even optimistic. They had shared just a few months, but they were genuine, the most authentic he had ever experienced. Then, without warning, she had vanished. He recalled waiting at the cafe for her, hours past their planned meeting, dialing her number repeatedly, only to reach voicemail. Eventually, he convinced himself she had moved on, that he had been foolish to believe it could endure. Now the truth confronted him in trembling lines of ink. Sarah hadn't abandoned him. She had been forced away. She wrote that when she informed his parents she was pregnant, they were livid. She came from a humble background, and they viewed her as a danger to their son's future. They had paid her to vanish, made her believe Henry was aware, and chose to stay uninvolved. She had tried to contact him, but every effort was blocked. When their daughter Emma was born, she raised her alone in a small town called Rivers Hills. And now Sarah was dying. Cancer, advanced stage. No treatments remained. She wrote with what little energy she had to plead that he come for their daughter before it was too late. She provided an address. No sentiment, no accusation, just one final request. "If you have any affection left for either of us, please look after her." Henry didn't realize he had sunk into his desk chair until he felt the weight of his body settle into the leather. His hands shook. His breath was unsteady. He couldn't recall the last time anything had shaken him so profoundly. He didn't even notice Jordan return until she softly asked if he needed anything. He looked up, eyes distant. "Cancel everything," he said softly. "I need to leave the city." By midday he was driving his black SUV, snow falling gently as the city faded behind him. The GPS was set for Rivers Hills. He didn't know what he would encounter there. He didn't know what Emma would look like, that she had been told about him, or whether she would even want to meet him. But he was certain of one thing. He couldn't let her be alone. Not again. Not because of him. Rivers Hills was nothing like New York. The roads were narrow, the buildings low and sparse, and the silence felt heavier than Henry expected. As he drove past snow-draped yards and shuttered shops with flickering signs, he felt like he had left his world behind. Everything here moved slower, but it wasn't calm he felt. It was apprehension. The letter Sarah sent included a home address, and that was where he was headed, gripping the steering wheel tighter with every turn. By the time he reached the house, the sky was grey and laden with more snow. It was a modest, aging home with peeling white paint and a slanted mailbox barely clinging to its post. The front porch had sagged slightly on one side, and a rusted tricycle lay overturned in the icy yard. Henry parked across the street, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath before stepping into the cold. He felt oddly out of place in his tailored coat and costly leather shoes, details that never mattered in his old life, but now did. As he crossed the road, he noticed police tape fluttering gently in the wind, stretched across the front steps. 2 social workers stood speaking softly near the entrance. One of them, a woman in her late 40s with a weary face and a clipboard pressed to her chest, noticed him approaching. She stepped forward warily. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing him with curiosity and mild suspicion. Henry introduced himself, explaining briefly that he had received a letter from Sarah Monroe. The woman's expression shifted instantly. Her eyes softened, and she gave him a look filled with quiet sympathy. "You're too late," she said softly. "She passed away last night in her sleep." The words didn't strike him immediately. They lingered, hollow at first, like a sough, and waiting to be processed. Henry blinked slowly, his breath catching in his throat. He looked past the woman to the house, as if hoping Sarah might still be inside, waiting for him, offering that familiar, crooked smile. But she was gone. He had missed her. And now the only person left was a little girl he had never met. A daughter who didn't even know he existed. "Where's Emma?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief and urgency. The woman hesitated, glancing at her colleague before responding. "She ran. When we came this morning to take her into protective custody, she panicked. We think she was scared they'd take her away forever. She slipped out the back door. We've got patrols searching now, and we're sending out alerts. But so far, no sign." Henry couldn't process it. His mind spun. How could it all unravel so quickly? One day ago, he was a man immersed in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Now he was a grieving would-be partner and a desperate father to a lost child in an unfamiliar town during a brutal cold snap. He turned away from the porch, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. "I'm not leaving without her," he muttered, more to himself than to the workers. He returned to the car without another word, slammed the door, and started the engine. The town suddenly felt vast. Every alley, every snow-covered bench, every school playground could be a hiding place. He drove in circles, scanning every sidewalk, every shadow, every huddled figure. At one point, he stopped at a gas station, printed out her photo from Sarah's old social media profile, one of the few he could find, and began showing it around. Most people shook their heads. Some offered vague directions. None were useful. He drove for hours. His phone died. His fingers froze. The night descended like a curtain, engulfing the town in silence. He was about to give up and head back to the hotel to regroup when he turned onto a quiet street near the industrial district and saw a bus stop. It was dimly lit, just a faint flicker from a cracked street lamp overhead. And beneath that flickering light, curled up on the bench in a thin pajama top, clutching a stuffed bear, was a small blonde girl. Henry slammed the brakes so hard the tires skidded across the icy road. He leapt out of the car and ran to her, heart pounding fiercely. She was pale, lips slightly blue, barely responsive. He wrapped his coat around her, lifted her into his arms, and rushed back to the car. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She just pressed her face against his shoulder, as if instinctively knowing he wasn't a stranger. He drove straight to the nearest hospital, his voice trembling as he shouted for help the moment he burst through the emergency entrance with her in his arms. Nurses rushed over, gently took her from him, placed her on a stretcher, and disappeared down the hallway, while Henry stood frozen in the lobby. For the first time in years, he prayed. Not for success, not for wealth, just for a little girl with his blood in her veins to survive the night. The hospital waiting room was nearly empty, lit by cold fluorescent lights that gave everything a sterile, surreal feel. Henry sat in a plastic chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly as if in silent prayer. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than it should have been. Every sound, footsteps in the hallway, a muffled voice over the intercom, made him look up, hoping for news. Time dragged, and the guilt in his chest grew heavier with every minute. He thought about Sarah, about how she had raised their daughter alone without a single word from him. He thought about Emma, a little girl who had lost her mother and now found herself shivering and unconscious in a hospital because the people meant to protect her failed. Because he failed. When the doctor finally approached, Henry stood so quickly the chair behind him scraped loudly against the floor. The doctor was calm, professional, but his weary eyes were kind. He told Henry that Emma was stable but weak, with early-stage hypothermia and exhaustion. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Her vitals were improving, but she was frightened and emotionally fragile. Henry asked if he could see her. The doctor nodded and led him down a quiet corridor to a small room with pale yellow walls where Emma lay tucked under thick white blankets. Her blonde hair was tangled, and the teddy bear she had, clutched at the bus stop, now rested beside her on the bed. Her eyes were open but tired, and when she saw him step into the room, she looked confused rather than scared. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. Everything about this moment felt wrong. He was a stranger to her, yet he had loved her mother. He carried the burden of knowing what she didn't, that her life had changed forever, that she would never go home again. He took a cautious step forward. "Hi," he said gently. "Do you remember me from the bus stop?" She gave a tiny nod, then looked away. Her voice was barely audible when she asked, "Are you the man who brought me here?" Henry nodded. "Yes, I'm Henry." She looked back at him, studying his costly clothes, his polished shoes. "You're wealthy," she said bluntly. "Why did you help me?" The question halted him. It was honest, without blame, just curiosity from a child trying to make sense of a world that had hurt her too much. He walked to her bedside, knelt so he was at her level, and said, "Because I'm your dad, Emma. I didn't know until recently. Your mom, she wrote to me. She wanted me to come for you." She stared at him for a long time, as if searching his face for truth. Then she looked down at her teddy bear, her small fingers gripping its paw tightly. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she asked quietly. Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. "Because I didn't know. If I had, I would have been there the moment you were born." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away stubbornly. Henry stayed with her that night, sitting in the chair beside her bed, not leaving, even to eat. When she fell asleep, her breathing soft and steady, he allowed himself to exhale just a little. She was here. She was alive. There was still time to make things right. And he would. He promised himself that, not with words, but with presence, with consistency, with every day that followed. The next morning brought a kind of delicate calm. Sunlight streamed through the hospital blinds, casting soft lines across the pale sheets on Emma's bed. Henry had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his coat draped over his lap, head leaning against the wall. He stirred when he heard a small voice say his name. When he opened his eyes, Emma was sitting up slightly, the teddy bear still tucked under her arm. She looked better. Her cheeks had some color again, and though her hair was still tangled, her eyes were clearer. Henry sat up quickly and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He asked how she felt, and she gave a small shrug. "Better, I think," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "I'm hungry." It was such a simple thing, but hearing her say it made something ache in his chest. He stood, offered her a weary smile, and said, "Let's fix that." He walked out of the room, spoke to the nurse, and within 20 minutes, a tray of warm oatmeal toast with jam and orange juice was wheeled in. Emma ate slowly, cautiously at first, as if unsure whether the food truly belonged to her. Henry watched from the edge of the bed, but said nothing. He didn't want to overwhelm her. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, just tentative, like they were still learning how to communicate. When she finished eating, she asked what would happen next. Henry told her gently that he wanted to take her home with him. She blinked. "To the big city?" He nodded. "To a home where you'll be safe, where you won't be alone." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her bear and hugged it tightly. "I don't have to go with the people from before?" she asked, and he understood she meant the social workers. He shook his head. Not if you don't want to. I spoke to them last night. I'm your legal guardian now. She looked up, studying his face as if weighing his words. Is it because you're wealthy? She asked again. Because you feel bad? Henry took a deep breath. It's because I'm your dad. Because I should have been there from the start, and I'm here now for real. Not because I pity you, but because I love you. The word felt big, almost too big, but he said it anyway. It wasn't a word he used often in his old life, not with his parents, not in boardrooms, not even in past relationships, but with her, it came naturally. She didn't respond immediately. She turned her head and looked out the window. Snow was falling gently outside. Then she said softly, I miss her. I know, Henry replied. Me too. He reached out slowly and placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. In that moment, something shifted. Not everything was healed. Not all questions were answered. But the wall between them had cracked, and through it came a faint light neither had expected. Later that afternoon, a social worker stopped by with paperwork and to check on Emma's condition. Henry answered all the questions with calm clarity, and the worker confirmed that custody would transfer fully within a few days as long as Emma agreed. When asked directly, Emma looked at Henry and gave a small nod. They left the hospital 2 days later. Henry had arranged a private car to take them to the city, wanting her to be comfortable. On the ride back, Emma looked out the window most of the time, holding her bear, but every so often she would glance at him and smile just a little. He didn't push for conversation. He knew trust wouldn't come all at once, but in that quiet car, with snow still falling outside and a little girl finally on her way to a new beginning, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt hope, and that, more than any deal or fortune, was the most valuable thing he had ever held. The return to New York felt surreal. Henry had lived in the city for decades, but this was the first time he returned not as a businessman or a CEO, but as a father. As the car crossed the bridge and the skyline came into view, Emma pressed her nose to the window, wide-eyed. She had never seen skyscrapers in real life. They look like glass mountains, she whispered. Henry smiled at her description, but he noticed how her grip on the teddy bear tightened as they neared the towering buildings. It was all new, loud, overwhelming. She was trying to be brave, but he could sense her nervousness like static in the air. He had already prepared everything. Her room had been completely redecorated in the penthouse. He asked the designers to make it feel warm and cozy, not sterile like the rest of his home. There were bookshelves filled with colorful stories, a canopy bed with soft blue sheets, a small desk, a reading nook by the window with oversized pillows, and a stuffed animal collection hand-picked by Henry himself. He didn't know what kids liked, but he had tried. When they arrived, Emma stood at the doorway to the room, silent. She walked inside slowly, touched the edge of the desk, then looked back at him. "All this is mine?" she asked. He nodded. "Everything. And if there's anything you don't like, we'll change it together." She didn't say anything, but she walked to the bed and sat down, her eyes scanning every detail. Henry stayed in the doorway, giving her space. She was no longer trembling. For the first time since he found her, she looked safe. The next few days were full of adjustments. Emma had trouble sleeping. She would wake up crying from nightmares, calling out for her mother. Henry would rush in each time, sit beside her and talk gently until she calmed down. Sometimes she would fall back asleep with her head resting on his arm. He cancelled every meeting, every appearance, and disconnected from the world he once ruled. His assistant and board were confused, some angry, some concerned, but he didn't care. For the first time in his life, a conference call didn't matter more than what was happening at home. He cooked breakfast, or tried to, burning eggs more than once. Emma found it funny. She started leaving little notes on the fridge. "Try oatmeal today," smiley face. "No more toast disasters." Her handwriting was messy, but her spirit was returning. They spent time walking in Central Park, visiting small museums and building puzzles in the living room. Henry found himself laughing in ways he hadn't in years. His phone sat silent in his pocket most days, and when it rang, he ignored it. But not everything was easy. Emma had outbursts. She sometimes refused to talk for hours or pushed her plate away untouched. She once locked herself in her room and cried for what felt like forever. Henry didn't handle every moment perfectly. He said the wrong thing sometimes or tried to fix things too fast, but he always returned to her side. He always apologized, and slowly she began to believe that he wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, while sorting through some of Sarah's old things, Henry found a memory box. Inside were drawings Emma had made, old birthday cards, photographs of their small life. Tucked between the pages of a worn notebook was a letter Sarah had written, but never sent. It was addressed to Emma, meant to be read when she was old enough. Henry read it quietly, tears slipping down his cheeks. In it, Sarah told Emma how much she loved her, how she had tried her best, and how, if this letter ever found its way to her, she hoped Emma would know that her father was not the villain of their story, that he had loved deeply once, that he would come back for her, even if it took time. Henry showed Emma the letter a few days later. She sat on the couch beside him, legs crossed under her, quietly reading each line. When she reached the end, she wiped her eyes with her sleeve and asked, "Do you think she knows we're together now?" Henry wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think she knew, even before we did. They didn't speak for a while after that. They didn't need to. It was still early in their journey, but something was building. A bond not based on obligation or guilt, but on love that had finally found its way home. And this time, Henry was determined not to lose it. The first real test of their fragile new life came unexpectedly one morning when Henry was on the phone in the kitchen, trying to gently decline an urgent request from a board member to attend a major investor meeting. He had been putting everything on hold for weeks, and the world he once controlled was starting to notice. Emma walked into the room just as his tone shifted, frustration creeping into his voice. She stopped at the door, her small hands gripping the edge of the frame, silently watching him. Henry didn't see her at first, but when he hung up, he turned and caught her staring. Her expression was unreadable, but something about the way she looked at him made his chest tighten. He knelt down to her level and smiled. "Everything's okay," he said. She didn't smile back. "Are you going to leave me too?" she asked. The question hit him like a blow. "No," he said immediately, too quickly. But she just stared. "You were angry. That's what happened before. Grown-ups get angry, and then people leave." Henry reached for her hand, holding it gently in both of his. "Emma, I'm not going anywhere. Not when I'm angry, not when I'm tired, not when things are hard. I'm here. You can count on me. Even if I mess up sometimes, I'll always be here." Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stepped into his arms and buried her face in his shoulder. That same day, Henry made a decision. He called an emergency board meeting, not to explain himself, but to resign as CEO. It shocked everyone. There was a storm of protest, panic in the voices of shareholders and executives, but he was calm. "I built this company," he said during the call, "but now I have to build something more important. I have a daughter. She needs me more than this boardroom ever did." He left the call with no regrets. Emma, overhearing part of it from the hallway, didn't say anything at first. But that night, as he tucked her in, she whispered, "You really meant it, didn't you?" He kissed the top of her head. Every word. Without the daily demands of corporate life, Henry began to rediscover parts of himself he had forgotten. He took Emma to bookstores where they picked out stories and read them together in bed. He helped her with schoolwork from the new tutor they hired. Though he was terrible at math, he tried anyway. They painted pottery at an art studio, attempted baking cookies that ended up looking like lava rocks, and spent long afternoons watching old animated movies and inventing alternate endings. They laughed more, and she began to tease him, like a real daughter would, calling him fancy dad whenever he wore his tailored shirts or boss man when he told her to eat vegetables. She started drawing pictures of their new life: a tall building, a man with messy brown hair, a little girl with a red teddy bear. Still, there were hard moments. She had meltdowns sometimes over small things like losing a puzzle piece or having to go to bed early. Henry learned not to fix everything, but to be there, to let her feel what she needed to feel. One evening, she got frustrated over a reading exercise and threw the book across the room. Instead of scolding her, he sat beside her on the floor and waited. Eventually, she climbed into his lap and whispered, "I miss Mommy." He hugged her tightly. "Me too," he said, and they sat together, saying nothing more. One night, as they walked home from a play they had gone to see together, Emma reached for his hand without being asked. They walked in silence for a block before she said, "You're really my dad now." He looked down, heart full. "I always was," he replied softly. She smiled but didn't look up. "Yeah," she said, "but now you're my dad in real life." That moment, simple and unscripted, was more valuable to Henry than any deal he had ever made, any applause he had ever received. The city lights glowed above them, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Spring arrived in the city with a quiet sense of renewal. Trees along the sidewalks began to bloom with soft green leaves, and the cold edge in the wind faded into something gentler. For Henry and Emma, the change in season mirrored something deeper that had been growing between them, a sense of normalcy that no longer felt fragile or borrowed. Their days had found a rhythm, not without imperfections, but with warmth and meaning. Henry had become more than a man who once led a corporation. He had become a man learning how to show up, how to listen, and how to be patient with both a child and himself. Emma had started attending a small school with a flexible schedule and a counselor who met with her weekly. At first, she was hesitant and kept to herself, but slowly she opened up. She made a friend named Olivia, a curious girl who liked to draw dragons and share her lunch. Emma began bringing stories home about their day, telling Henry about the games they played and the things they learned. He listened to every word with genuine interest, asking questions, encouraging her curiosity, and occasionally marveling at how much of Sarah he could see in the way Emma spoke or tilted her head when she was deep in thought. One afternoon, as they were walking back from school, Emma stopped suddenly on the sidewalk. She turned to him and said, "Do you think Mommy would be proud of me?" The question caught him off guard. He knelt down beside her and looked her in the eyes. "I think she would be more than proud. I think she'd be amazed by you." Emma smiled, but it wavered at the edges. "Sometimes I think I forget what her voice sounded like." Henry placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "That's okay. You carry her in, you in everything you do, and if you ever forget something, I'll help you remember." Later that week, Henry brought home a small box he'd picked up from storage. Sarah's Joe's. Unal. He had hesitated for days about whether to give it to Emma, unsure if she was ready, but something about her question made him believe she was. That night he sat beside her as she carefully opened the journal, flipping through pages filled with Sarah's handwriting. There were stories about Emma as a toddler, moments of laughter and exhaustion, doodles in the margins, and little notes of hope written like love letters to the future. Emma didn't cry while reading, but her grip on his arm tightened, and when she closed the journal she whispered, "She really loved me, didn't she?" Henry nodded. More than anything. As the days passed, Emma grew braver. She began asking about Sarah more, not just about memories, but about their love story. Henry shared it all, even the parts that hurt, their brief happiness, the misunderstandings, the cruel decisions made by his parents, and the years he spent believing Sarah had simply walked away. He told her about the moment he received the letter, how it shattered and saved him all at once. Emma listened closely, sometimes frowning, sometimes smiling. In the end, she said, "I think Mommy forgave you. She wouldn't have sent the letter if she didn't." That spring also brought new challenges. Emma began to question the permanence of her life again, not in words but in behavior. She became clingy at night, asked repeatedly if Henry would always be there, if he could promise never to disappear. It was a fear buried deep, rooted in the pain of having lost everything once. Henry never dismissed her questions. Instead, he created rituals, reading a bedtime story every night, leaving a note in her lunchbox, and even recording a message on her small music player saying, "I'll always come back for you." Then one day, out of the blue, Emma brought home a flyer from school. It was for a father-daughter dance. She placed it on the kitchen counter and waited for him to see it. Henry picked it up and smiled. "You want to go?" he asked. She shrugged, but her eyes sparkled. "Only if you'll dance." He laughed, a deep and joyful sound that came from a place in him he never knew existed. "I'll dance badly, but I'll be there." They went shopping for her dress that weekend, and Emma picked a pale lavender gown with tiny embroidered stars. She twirled in the dressing room and asked, "Do I look like a princess?" Henry replied, "You look like you rule the whole kingdom." On the night of the dance, Henry wore a suit, not one of his usual ones, but something simpler, softer, chosen by Emma herself. They arrived at the school gym, which had been transformed with fairy lights and paper lanterns. Emma stayed close to him at first, shy, but eventually joined the other girls. Henry watched her from the sidelines, his heart full, until she returned and said, "You promised to dance, remember?" They danced, awkward and slow at first, then laughing and spinning as the music picked up. Other parents clapped, and for the first time, Henry felt like he truly belonged in this new world. As they left the dance, Emma leaned against him in the car, drowsy but content. "You're good at being a dad," she murmured. Henry looked at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes soft. "I had the best teacher," he said, thinking of both Emma and Sarah. And in that quiet car, rolling through the city night, he felt a peace he had never earned before, but had finally allowed himself to accept. Summer brought warmth and light that seemed to mirror the transformation in both Henry and Emma's lives. The city, once a place of shadows and silence for Emma, had become a playground, a landscape of discovery where she could laugh, learn, and live without fear. And for Henry, each passing day deepened his understanding of what it meant to be a father. He no longer woke to business alerts or headlines. Instead, his mornings began with Emma's small footsteps padding across the hall, her voice asking about pancakes or books, or whether squirrels could really remember where they buried their acorns. Life had become beautifully ordinary. One afternoon, while they were walking through a street fair near Central Park, Emma stopped in front of a booth selling handmade bracelets. She studied them quietly, then picked up one with blue and silver beads. She turned to Henry and asked, "Can I get this one for Mommy?" Her voice was soft but sure. Henry crouched beside her and nodded. "Of course." Emma held it gently, almost reverently, and whispered, "I want to leave it for her. At the cemetery, like a thank you." Henry didn't need to ask for what. He understood it was for the letter, for the love, for giving her a life she could still hold on to, even in loss. They visited Sarah's grave that weekend, driving upstate to the small, quiet plot where she had been buried. Emma brought flowers and the bracelet, and she sat for a long time in front of the headstone, talking quietly, her voice carried away by the wind. Henry didn't listen to every word. He gave her space. But when she came back to him, her face was peaceful in a way he hadn't seen before. "I told her everything," she said. "She knows I'm okay now." Henry knelt beside her and put an arm around her shoulder. "And she's proud of you. I'm sure of it." That evening, back in the city, they sat on the balcony of their apartment, watching the skyline turn golden pink. Emma had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, the bear in her arms, her legs tucked up under her dress. Henry didn't move her. He just sat still, sipping a cup of tea, thinking about how far they had come. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was full of the presence of shared memories and healing. In the weeks that followed, Henry received several offers to return to the corporate world, consulting positions, board seats, even a book deal. He declined them all. Instead, he began volunteering with a local charity that helped support children who had lost a parent. He spoke little of his own story, but he listened to others, and sometimes he brought Emma with him. She would draw pictures for the other kids or read books aloud, her voice clear and calm. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Emma chopping vegetables with careful focus and Henry attempting a new pasta recipe, she said, "You know, I used to think rich people didn't have hearts." He looked up, surprised. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I know some of them do." He laughed, setting down the spoon. "Just some?" She nodded firmly. "Only the ones who learn how to use them." They sat down to eat at the small kitchen table, their plates steaming, music playing softly in the background. There was no ceremony, no milestone being marked, but Henry felt it in his bones. This was the moment everything had led to. Not the discovery, not the rescue, not the letters or the court papers, but this. Two people, once strangers to each other, now a family in every real and quiet way that mattered. When bedtime came, Emma turned and asked, "Can I call you Dad now?" "Not Henry." He froze for a second, something inside him cracking open in the best way. "I'd like that," he said. She hugged him tightly, burying her face in his shirt. "Good night, Dad." He whispered back, "Good night, sweetheart," and kissed the top of her head. As the lights dimmed and the city moved around them, Henry felt no more guilt, no more distance. What had once been broken had not just been repaired, it had been rebuilt, not as it was before, but stronger, deeper, and more real than he had ever believed possible. Emma was no longer a girl lost, tea in the cold. She was home, and so was he. The ending works because it trades spectacle for sincerity. Instead of a grand twist, we watch two people, one bruised by loss, the other hardened by success, choose the slow everyday work of loving each other. Emma's simple "Goodnight, Dad" lands harder than any boardroom victory because it shows a bond earned through presence rather than purchased with wealth. Henry's transformation feels authentic precisely because the finale doesn't crown him a hero. It leaves him a learner, kneeling beside a child who's teaching him what legacy really means. The story closes not with perfection, but with possibility. And that open-ended hope is what makes it memorable.